Greetings and salutations, friends! The wait is finally over. The time you've all been waiting for has arrived. We are back with another big lore series, this time with the Badab War, the successor to the Siege of Rats. And like with all good sequels, we are taking things a fair few steps further. For as massive as the siege was, the Badab conflict absolutely dwarfs it. The history of the Badab sector as a battleground stretches back over a millennia, and the main conflict that we will be concentrating on over the course of this video series would rage for 12 years, and involve forces from 17 chapters of the God Emperor's Adeptus Astartes. It would be a conflict that would see entire worlds burned and billions dead at the hands of those who should have been their protectors. It was a war the likes of which the Imperium had not seen since Warmaster Horus purged his legions at Istvan and turned his burning gaze on distant terror. A war to shake the very fundament of humankind's empire and raise uncomfortable questions about its oh-so-sacred angels. It would see the attempted resurrection of a legion, the crippling of chapters and the dying moments of Space Marine lords. It would be superhuman warfare at its most absolute and brutal. It is therefore a small wonder indeed that after such an epic struggle for the Maelstrom Zone, that the God Emperor's most holy Inquisition declared an edict of obliteration. All records pertaining to the war were to be burned, alongside those unfortunate individuals found to be in possession of them. And only the Ordo Hereticus' most faithful subjects would ever know the full scale and horror of the events that transpired in the void lit by the baleful light of the Maelstrom. Fortunately for you all, such petty concerns of clearance and security hardly affects one such as I. But we are skipping a few steps, are we not? For as mentioned, the seeds of this strife were sown long, long ago. So let us begin, shall we, by setting the stage. For those who would eventually be reviled as villains were once lauded as heroes. And rightfully so, for our story truly begins more than 1,000 years before the ultimate end of what we call the Badab War. Laughable name, really. The Badab War, as if it was a singular event, the first and last war in that blighted portion of the galaxy. The Badab Wars might be a better name for it. The area of space known as the Badab Sector and the surrounding area referred to as the Maelstrom Zone lie close to an ancient warp vortex, a baby sibling, if you will, to the Great Eye. This storm, the Maelstrom, would lend its name to many surrounding zones and sectors, and many of these occupy a rather rare and interesting position within the Imperium of Man, because technically speaking, these zones are not a part of the Imperium. But they are occupied by Imperial citizens living on what for all intents and purposes are Imperial worlds. For example, the area we will principally be talking about is known as the Maelstrom Adjacent Autonomous Imperial Resource Extraction Zone Grid 004-357. Administratum dryness aside, the name includes a very important word: autonomous. Now, the overwhelming majority of worlds within the Great Imperium of Man are already granted extensive powers of self-governance. To brutally oversimplify a monstrously complex administrative system, as long as the Imperium receives its taxes, it could not care less about the minutiae of planetary governance. Even seemingly major events like a full-blown world-covering civil war will be completely and utterly ignored by the Imperium so long as the planet's tithe is delivered on time. So when the Adeptus Administratum goes so far as to name his own autonomous, that indicates a truly galactic level of no fucks given. But such a lack of direct oversight should not be taken as indicative of the absence of importance. Quite the contrary, in fact. The zone, as the name Resource Extraction Grid implies, is home to several bountiful worlds rich in rare minerals. There are worlds nestled within the mind-numbingly massive voids of the zone that could feed a dozen Forge worlds for centuries. And even more crucially is the ease with which these minerals can be extracted. To give you a real-world example to paint a picture, if you wanted an ounce of gold at 30 grams or so, you would probably need to process somewhere between 4 to 8 tons of raw ore to obtain it. So, 4 to 8 tons of material for 30 grams of product. Several of the Imperium's more arcane pieces of technology, plasma weapons or drives, the MIU link used in Titan god machines, etc., oft require minerals so unfathomably rare as to make gold appear as nothing more than common gravel. On other worlds, you might process 1 trillion tons of soil to produce 12 grams of these materials. Whilst within the grid, there are planets where an explorer might be able to literally pick chunks of it straight up from the ground. In other words, there are planets within the Maelstrom adjacent zone where an intrepid rogue trader might become a multi-billionaire with a couple swings of a shovel. That should give you some indication as to how incredibly valuable this resource grid is to the Imperium, and also go some way as to indicate how many worlds might be relying upon a continuous uninterrupted stream of tithe and supply ships flowing out of the Maelstrom zones. And in a rare spot of uncharacteristic good fortune for the Imperium, that was the case. Ever since the Great Crusade, the resources have flowed in a near uninterrupted stream from the Maelstrom Zone. Indeed, the biggest problems involved in extracting these resources was the zone itself. Now, we need to touch briefly upon the meaning of the word zone in Imperial terms. Normally, it refers to a considerable area of space inside of which several solar systems are present. The size of a zone can vary considerably. Everything from a few dozen solar systems of high importance and therefore worthy of their own unique designation to thousands of solar systems of marginal importance. This is because the designation zone has nothing to do with a fixed area, or a specific quantity of space or planets, or even a specific value of those planets. Instead, it is a purely administrative designation. And as we've previously talked about, our resource extraction zone is a little bit of an unusual area in terms of the Adeptus Administratum's jurisdiction. The first, most obvious and immediate difference is the sheer size of the zone. It stretches across 100 or more light years. And in all due actuality, no one really knows precisely how large it is or where exactly its borders are. This is not for lack of trying, mind you, but due to the fact that mapping the area of space is essentially impossible. As mentioned, the resource extraction grid, one of several, surrounds or, as the Administratum puts it, is adjacent to the Maelstrom, a massive warp storm that I referred to as the baby version of the Great Eye. which may in fact be a bit of an uncharitable interpretation, since the Maelstrom Warpstorm Zone is the second largest of its kind in the entire galaxy. The baby version comes more from its relative stability rather than its size. And as with all warp storms, the laws of reality do not necessarily apply. And when they do, you can never quite know to what extent or for how long they may be in effect. For whilst again, the Maelstrom is relatively stable, we are speaking in relative terms of warp storms here. And so its influence will wax and wane seemingly at random. And so an explorator vessel returning to a planet that it has already visited a dozen times before to pick up yet another routine load of valuable minerals might find itself suddenly in a completely uncharted area of space with no frame of reference as to how it got there or how it might make it back again. Simultaneously, a completely routine patrol through a desolate region of space might suddenly find itself speeding at top speed towards a gargantuan planetoid that appeared, apparently, out of thin air. And of course, those are but the more mundane dangers of operating in the vicinity of a warp storm. There are considerably more malicious entities bumbling about as well. Entities that, should they happen across an unfortunate Imperial ship, well, that vessel would in all due likelihood never be heard from again, or if it were to be heard from or spotted, it would probably be in the form of an unmanned drifting ghost hulk somewhere in the periphery of the Maelstrom, with no evidence whatsoever as to what may have happened to its once crew. With all of this in mind and much, much more, I'm sure you can see how creating accurate maps would be problematic. And whilst considerable effort was expended to try and map out at least relatively stable warp lanes, trade routes, and the locations of important systems and planets, which met with some success, the very idea of ever creating a truly firm map, idea, or system of borders or limits within the edges of the Maelstrom was always a fool's errand. And so, instead, the Imperium established outposts, major bastions of power and authority, from which the countless men and women of the Imperial Guard and the Imperial Navy could reach out across the outer edges of the Maelstrom, establishing yet further footholds upon worlds, upon asteroid belts, and even creating fully independent space-borne stations to serve as rallying points and refuel and resupply areas for the Imperial Navy and Adeptus Mechanicus efforts to explore, protect, and pacify the zones. Over the course of centuries and millennia, some of these outposts grew more and more in stature and importance, becoming hubs of Imperial activity within the outer edges of the Maelstrom Zone, drawing in yet further settlers from across the Imperium, and also vast quantities of Adeptus Administratum bureaucrats trying to figure out where the wealth was and where to send it once it was acquired. Eventually, 3 of these early outposts would grow into small systems in their own rights. The star systems Cygnax, Sagan, and Badab. These 3 systems formed at once a shield, protecting the rest of the Imperium against the malignant entities of the Maelstrom, and also a chain through which supplies and resources could flow betwixt the various sectors and then eventually out of the Maelstrom Zone into the Carthago sector, and after that into the rest of the Imperium. And this happy state of affairs would of course continue on forever. Happy ending, right? Like hell, I already hear you yell. Yes, indeed, happy endings are not really a part of 40K's job description, now is it? And so, after a long period of increasing hostility within the Maelstrom sector, everything came to a head during 577 Millennia 41. Now, of course, the zones adjacent to the Maelstrom were never safe or secure by any stretch of the imagination. The countless unnatural hazards were only outmatched by the more mundane ones. In fact, by far the most ceaseless threat to any voidfarer in this area of space were good, old-fashioned pirates. It might even sound kind of boring. I mean, you're in an area of space where at any moment your ship might be swept 1,000,000 miles off course and dumped straight down into the middle of a star with no forewarning, or simply be dumped in an unknown area of space to wander lost forevermore without any hope of ever returning home. Or the vessel might at any instant simply be devoured by a void-dwelling leviathan, which transforms everyone aboard into gibbering lunatics, stranding the vessel not in real space, but in the immaterial tides of the realms of the gods. And yet, with all of this fanciful fuckery flying about, the most persistent danger nevertheless remains pirates. At least it isn't just boring old human pirates, for many races in the 41st millennium have taken up the profession of buccaneering, seeing ways to make an easy earning of the other inhabitants of the galaxy. And with the Imperium of Man spread as it is across an unfathomable area of space, there's a lot of places for entrepreneuring swashbucklers to hide and ply their trade in relative peace. And whilst, of course, the Imperium, and indeed most races that operate large-scale trade networks, will do their very best to deal with these marauders, it is an awfully large galaxy, and in an area like the Maelstrom, well, the space in and of itself is one problem, but I'm sure you're getting tired of me mentioning all of the navigational hazards at this point. It is a risky place to hide, no doubt, but the risk also means increased safety for those of a more nefarious profession. There are very, very few Imperial Navy patrols that dare plumb the depths of the Maelstrom. They instead stay primarily on already cleared and organized trade routes or running escorts for particularly large and vital tithe fleets. Of course, if a band of freebooters become particularly successful, then the Imperial Navy will make an active effort to root them out, in all due likelihood calling upon aid from Battlefleet Carthago nearby, by far the largest and most powerful fleet organization available at the time. But these instances are very rare, few and far between. A band of pirates need to be quite the thorn in the Imperium's side to dispatch such forces into an autonomous zone. A little bit of loss here and there was entirely expected in such an area, and as long as the primary systems of the Maelstrom Zone remained intact, the Imperium was more than happy to simply just live and let live. But unfortunately, there were far more malignant forces lurking within the outer edges of the Maelstrom than mere pirates. And this was something that the vital outpost world of Cygnax was to discover, much to its detriment, in 577 Millennia 41. And so we return back to the original point. The world of Cygnax, as previously mentioned, was one of 3 primary outpost worlds alongside Badab and Sagan. As befits such a vital planet, Cygnax was heavily militarized. It had a massive PDF presence, along with Imperial Guard garrison forces, planetary defense naval elements, and to top it all off, Cygnax was also a hive world. Dotted across its surface would have been several immense hive cities, containing billions of people, millions of planetary defense auxiliary, and of course each and every hive city in and of itself was a self-contained, mammoth fortified man-made mountain of steel and gun batteries. Furthermore, the hive cities would also be in possession of anti-orbital weaponry. Everything from cyclopean las batteries to torpedo silos equipped with nuclear warheads of mass destruction. And as a final little flourish on top of this hedgehog of death and annihilation, Cygnax was also located within striking distance of the Endymion cluster, where the Mantis warriors had their primary base of operations. And so in the case of enemy aggression, the Hive world could expect to be reinforced by a chapter of the Adeptus Astartes. Frankly, any assault upon a world like this would be an extraordinarily ill-advised undertaking for all but the most massive, heavily armored, and reinforced enemy assaults. This is the kind of world that would be expected to stand up to virtually any enemy for months and years, until a reinforcement and relief expedition could be organized on behalf of the wider Imperium. To put it all yet further into perspective, the siege of Vrax in its entirety could probably be likened to the assault upon but a single hive city. And Cygnax, although we do not know the precise numbers of hive cities on the planet, could have had dozens of these monumental cities. Cygnax was in the perfect position to withstand any external enemy for however long it might be required to. But you probably noticed the choice of words there. External enemies. For you see, whilst the Imperium had most certainly been aware of a general increase in hostile activity within the fringes of the Maelstrom Zone, they had failed to grasp just how severe the problem was. And they would fail to grasp it until, across Cygnax, in each and every hive city, billions upon billions of Chaos cultists rose up in a unified wave of mass murder and slaughter. Within hours, the entire planet was plunged into one massive, globe-spanning civil war. Hard data about this insurrection is difficult to come by. At this point in time, the wider Imperium and the higher lords of the Adeptus Administratum had yet to truly turn their gaze upon the Autonomous Zone, and whatever transpired within it was mostly overlooked. Planets flourished and fell almost entirely unwitnessed by the eyes of the Imperium at large. But Cygnax, of course, was a far more important planet than most. We do know that the insurrection must have raged for months at the very least, and probably years, because the Mantis warriors located in the nearby Endymion cluster were able to reinforce the loyalists on the planet. This undoubtedly tipped the scale quite considerably in the favor of the loyalists. But unfortunately, the insurrectionists did not simply wake up one morning, get out of bed on the wrong side, and therefore decide to slaughter their friends and family and set fire to their grandparents' house. This was no random insurrection, nor even was it a case of mass hysteria due to some warp phenomenon. This was a carefully planned and organized assault upon Cygnax, organized by the little-known Chaos warband known as the Reborn. Described as wearing ancient, outdated armor and wielding archaic forms of weaponry. These giants in rusted orange led many of the Chaos cultists' larger assaults upon the Hive cities, spearheading their efforts to breach the defenses, and eventually must have been successful. All we really know about the final hours of Cygnax is that apparently a group of Chaos cultists, presumably led by their Chaos Space Marine allies, breached one of the Hive City's primary control centers, and through it gained access to the city's vast stockpile of nuclear weaponry. Normally, such weapons were reserved for anti-orbital warfare, fired at huge starships in orbit, but due to undoubtedly techno-heretical means and a lack of care taken on behalf of Cygnax Planetary Defense Auxiliary, soon nuclear and plasma warheads were raining down across the planet, tearing gouges out of Hive cities, obliterating starports, and vaporizing entire areas of the planet. Eventually, however, probably due to the unsanctioned means required to redirect the weaponry themselves, the heretics, in all due likelihood, pushed the wrong button. And the globe was rocked by a blast so powerful that it pushed the planet out of its orbit. That is not the result of a scattering of nuclear or plasma warheads. That signifies to me the simultaneous mass detonation of several Hive cities worth of weaponry. To give a general idea of the kind of energy we're talking about here, if we were to try to move Earth out of its orbit, that would require, probably in far excess of, 1 billion nuclear bombs. Now that's a firecracker to catch the attention of even the High Lords of Terror. For whilst the loss of a single world would usually be a rather insignificant thing in all due reality, the Imperium is simply that vast. But Cygnax, as mentioned, was of far grander importance than most planetoids spinning aimlessly through the void. It was a key anchor world in the Maelstrom reaches, and with its fall, dozens upon dozens of other planets and outposts were suddenly shorn from their protector, from their safe base of operation, and the closest source to immediate reinforcements. And that, of course, was the most important factor. The reason why Cygnax was considered a capital world, a linchpin entity in the Maelstrom region, was because it was so heavily militarized. If a nearby planet was assaulted by pirates or alien raiders, then Cygnax could mobilize immediately, dispatch Imperial Guard regiments and Imperial Navy reserves to come to the rescue of the planet. And if Cygnax's own reserves were not sufficient to deal with the threat, they would slow the enemy's advance for long enough for the other capital worlds, like Sagan and Badab, to also mobilize their own resources. In other words, Cygnax was the guardian entity for this area of the outer Maelstrom reaches. Without it, the worlds that once relied upon its protection now faced a stark choice. Either they would have to uproot entire planetary populations, which could vary from 10-20,000 people to 10-20 billions of people. Or they would have to go at it alone. They would have to assure their own protection. They would have to fortify. They would have to dig in and entrench themselves with the assumption that were they to be attacked, then the nearest source of Imperial reinforcements would be at the very least 2 to 3 months away. Now that's a long time in terms of a major planetary invasion, but in terms of a rapid strike by Dark Eldar slavers, Orc freebooters, or Chaos Raiders, it may as well be an infinite span of time. as any of the aforementioned 3 threats, not to mention the myriad other problems that might befall a planet this close to a warp storm, they would all either be long gone or have done all the damage they conceivably could have before the reinforcements arrive. Indeed, in such a scenario, in all due likelihood, nearby Imperial planets would not even bother dispatching troops, well aware of the fact that the enemy they'd be sent to fight would be weeks, if not months, gone by the time they arrived. And to pour yet further misery on top of this already rather thick shit sandwich, the death of Cygnax did not merely just deprive these planets of their primary protector, it also in fact became one of the largest sources of danger for these planets. Bearing in mind, Cygnax was not destroyed. The planet was still there. It was an irradiated hellhole covered in permanent radioactive winter, and unlivable by any human standards for any extended periods of times. But it used to be one of the capital worlds of an extraordinarily rich, albeit dangerous, sector. I think you can see where I'm going with this. Yes, indeed. Cygnax may be reduced to nothing more than a spinning celestial carcass in the firmament, but as far as carcasses goes, this was buried Egyptian royalty. Now, of course, the absolute uppermost stratas of Cygnax society, the governors, the merchant princes, and the lieges of the clergy will have evacuated themselves and as much of their wealth as possible. But this is still a hive world, with billions upon billions of inhabitants, with massive sprawling industries enough to feed an entire sector. This was a planet that supported millions of PDF, and God Emperor only knows how many regiments of Imperial Guard garrison forces and Imperial Navy troops as well. Even if we assumed that everyone who had the opportunity to do so left with everything they could leave with, that would still leave mind-boggling amounts of wealth, of resources, of materiel and technology literally just lying strewn across the streets of Cygnax, with no one there to guard it, and no one there to prevent local entrepreneurs from helping themselves to it. Such a smorgasbord quickly drew in all the most undesirable elements of the galaxy. Pirates, raiders, looters, scavengers, treasure hunters, both human and Xenos, began flocking into the sector, to Cygnax in particular. The planet almost certainly taking on a near mythical aspect amongst the lowlives of the galaxy. Boundless wealth, mountains of treasure, archaeotech of baffling rarity, and near infinite worth. Now, what do you think such rumors might do for a sector that already had a pretty damn severe problem with pirates and ne'er-do-wells? Yes indeed. With the fall of Cygnax, not only had the Maelstrom adjacent autonomous Imperial resource extraction zone grid lost one of its 3 primary pillars, Cygnax had also become a source of increased heretical and pirate activity within the grid. And just like dominoes, it was now a real threat that Sagan and Badab might also fall to increased hostile activity. If that happened, or indeed if just one more of these pillars collapsed, practically all Imperial control over this vital grid would be lost. And if that were to happen, the continued steady operation and supply of dozens upon dozens of Forge Worlds would be threatened. The repercussions would ripple out across the galaxy all the way to Holy Terra itself. This was an unacceptable state of affairs. The continued steady stream of resources, and rare minerals in particular, from the resource extraction grid had to be assured. And so the High Lords of Terra convened and put down an Edict Imperialis ordering the establishment of an Adeptus Astartes presence in the resource extraction grid. A clear signifier of the value placed upon the Maelstrom adjacent zones by the High Lords. The God Emperor Space Marines are few and far between, their worth as individuals far outstripping that of entire battalions of Imperial Guardsmen, and the value of a chapter is incomparable even to most Imperial Guard armies. And the Higher Lords of Terra's decree put down that not only one chapter, but a full 4 chapters would be dedicated to the protection of the resource extraction grid. These 4 chapters would be the Lamenters, the Charnel Guard, the Mantis Warriors, and the Astral Claws. 4,000 of the Imperium's finest, most elite warriors, along with their naval assets boasting strike cruisers and battle barges aplenty, would move into the resource extraction grid, secure it, and pacify it. That last order was one that the High Lords were going to regret, but that is a topic for another day. With this, I will wrap up the first episode in the Badab War. Now you will have a general idea of why this particular area of space was so valuable indeed as to warrant the deployment of 4,000 Space Marines. And next, we will have a closer look at these 4 founding chapters that together would make up the Warders of the Maelstrom. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.